students, Mr. John here with Chapter 23, Lesson 3. It's called War with Spain. And hey, that's what it is all about. Let's take a look back. Cuba was one of the first conquests of the Spanish Empire. Like imperialism, you have old imperialism, new imperialism. The oldest of the old imperialism was like that Spanish Empire and the conquistadors. Remember, Columbus discovered America on behalf of the Spanish. They were the ones that would pay for his trip. So Cuba had been under Spanish rule for centuries. After a few hundred years of that, you get to the 1800s, and they decided, late 1800s, and they're like, enough is enough, and they started to have insurrection and rebellion within Cuba. They were destroying Spanish property and things like that, in the hopes that the Spanish would leave, but Spain did not leave. But rather tighten the noose, so to speak, causing starvation, death, and disease among the native Cuban populace. Enter the United States. Okay. The USA as a whole was keeping a close eye on Cuba. U.S. businesses were worried about the possible loss of property as well as trade within Cuba. The U.S. government just didn't like the idea of having civil war so close to home. Cuba is not that far off the coast of Florida, and you know that political instability is just bad for the region. The American people in general were horrified by the way that the Spanish had treated, or was treating the Cubans. The Spanish don't really have a good track record of treating native people very well. I mean, the U.S. doesn't either, but Spain was pretty bad. The U.S. press kept an exceptionally close eye on Cuba, reporting every incident and atrocity to the American people. They took a great deal of liberty, exaggerating stories, and even at times just making things up to kind of stir resentment towards Spain and empathy towards the Cuban people. This is called yellow journalism. It's a word that's still thrown around today, but the more common buzzword of the last year for yellow journalism would be fake news. Oh, that's not real, that's fake news. That's basically the modern word for yellow journalism. See, relying on sensationalism and exaggeration to basically sell newspapers. Now, this leads us to the USS Maine. Responding to public pressure, President McKinley sent an American battleship, USS Maine, down to Havana, which is a major city of Cuba, and its mission was to protect American interests in the country. Well, on the night of February 15th, 1898, there was a huge explosion aboard the Maine, and it killed 260 Americans. The American press blamed the Spanish. It was thought to have been maybe a Spanish mine. Later evidence supports that it was some kind of internal failure, like an engine exploded or something like that. Regardless, the press got a hold of it, and public opinion swayed, and it was pretty much used as the reason to start the Spanish-American War, which began on April 25th, 1898, when Congress made the official declaration of war. After the Maine, it's sort of like ultimatums, but Spain tried to concede a little bit, and it wasn't enough, and Congress declared war. Now, the events of Cuba may have triggered the war. Events in Cuba. Note, change that. Events in Cuba may have triggered the war, but it would begin elsewhere. The Philippines are a chain of islands in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of China. At the time, they were a colony of Spain and a home base for a large Spanish fleet. On May 1st, 1898, the U.S. Admiral Dewey launched a surprise naval attack on this Spanish fleet in Manila Bay and destroyed it. American troops landed in the Philippines and were actually assisted in the takeover of the islands by native Filipino rebels. The rebels were hopeful that the Americans would free them from Spanish rule and then grant them independence, but this would not be the case, as we'll see in a little bit when we get back to the Philippines. Meanwhile, over in Cuba, the U.S. fleet had trapped the Spanish fleet in Santiago Harbor and began landing troops in Cuba, where they joined forces with essentially Cuban rebels. Among the American troops was a regiment of volunteers known as the Rough Riders. This regiment consisted mostly of cowboys and college students, and it was led by none other than Theodore Roosevelt, who had left his job at the Navy to volunteer and go fight in the Spanish-American War. Here they are, real picture. Alright, so perhaps the most famous land battle of the Spanish-American War was the Battle of San Juan Hill, where the Rough Riders, among others, including a heavy presence of African-American soldiers, stormed a fortified Spanish position on San Juan Hill, and had to go all uphill against fortified soldiers. It's a great disadvantage, but they still managed to win the day. Only a few days later, after San Juan Hill, the Spanish fleet tried to pop out of Santiago Harbor, and they were met there by the U.S. Navy, which destroyed them. After the Spanish ship was destroyed outside of Santiago Harbor, pretty much Spanish resistance in Cuba came to an end. But the U.S. moved on to the Spanish colony of Puerto Rico, and it did not take long to secure the island. On August 12, Spain signed an armistice, which is a fancy word for like a truce or ceasefire, pretty much ending the war. The Spanish-American War is sometimes referred to as the Splendid Little War, as only a few hundred Americans died. I believe it was about 400 died in combat, and then it was like 2,000 died of disease. But still, the relatively low cost in lives compared to what we gained out of it, which was sort of a reputation as a major military power of the world. People felt pretty good about it. Here's a little map. There's Santiago Harbor. The fleet was just waiting for them. Now, when the U.S. and Spain signed their treaty, officially ending the war, I believe it is the winter, the Empire of Spain that they had was broken up. Cuba became a U.S. protectorate. That basically means Cuba had its own self-rule, but they were kind of under the influence and military protection of the United States. Kind of like we took them under our wing is what it was. The U.S. also gained the islands of Puerto Rico and Guam, which became U.S. territories, which basically falls under the total control of the host nation, in this case the United States. Cuba was granted its independence after much debate in 1901, but only after the Platt Amendment, which allowed the U.S. to have a base on the Cuban islands of Guantanamo Bay. It was just still there. So yeah, we said, all right, you be independent, but we want a permanent naval base here. Said, okay. Cuba couldn't make any treaties with any other foreign powers. That's pretty strict, but okay. And the U.S. would take military action if Cuban independence was threatened. So this is what the Platt Amendment. Puerto Rico, as mentioned, became a U.S. territory. All citizens were granted U.S. citizenship in 1917, though some citizens wanted Puerto Rico to be independent. There's not much to say about Puerto Rico. Every once in a while you hear something in the news about Puerto Rico becoming the 51st state, but it never ends up happening, which is good because then we'd all have to buy new American flags with 51 stars. Back to the topic of the Philippines. Going back there, there was a lot of debate on what to do with the Philippines. The anti-imperialists within America said it was basically like a travesty to annex the Philippines. You know, they had been fighting for freedom, and then against the Spanish, and then we go in and beat the Spanish. It would be bad if we just took them over just as the Spanish had. You actually had some big names on these anti-imperialist front, guys like Mark Twain, the author, and Andrew Carnegie, you know, the philanthropist and rich guy. Imperialist factions within the nation wanted the Philippines as another stepping stone towards China, a naval base, and things like that, and a large market to sell U.S. goods. These imperialist notions won out, and the Philippines became part of became official U.S. territory in 1989. That very same month, it was February, Filipino rebels started fighting the U.S. And it was a very costly little insurrection and war. A lot of people died. A lot of Filipinos died, like over 100,000, but mostly of starvation and disease. It was also an exceptionally expensive affair for the United States. We ended up setting up a new government there with the intention of them becoming self-ruling, which they finally did in 1946 when they were granted their independence. That's it for today. You're going to have a quiz on the next page. It'll be your basic quiz. Try to make it 10 points, 5 questions, multiple choice. And that's it for today. Our next lesson will be, I believe, policies of Latin America. And that very well might be our last official lesson of the school year. I haven't quite decided yet. We'll see. But you'll still have a study day in the test. We're going to finish out the chapter as we always do. Alright, that's all for today. Let me know if you have any questions. Have a good one.